Thank you guys all for coming today. We feel like we have to first address why we're here in Mark 1 Chapel today instead of the Great Hall. I know for half of you guys, this is your first Colloquium presentation, our new ISM students, so this won't seem weird to you, but it is kind of weird. And so this is for several reasons, but our change of location is very deliberate because our goal in this presentation today is to recapture the sacred setting for the two pieces that we're going to have you all sing for us, which were first created during the early years of the Scottish Reformation. The first piece we're going to examine and sing is the Scottish four-part tune to Psalm 42, which was composed by the Scottish Reformation composer David Peebles and collected in the Woad Psalter. You'll find that in the slip inside as Herz will faint. The second is a piece that is a meditation and a poem on Psalm 42, composed by the Scottish poet Elizabeth Melville, who was the first Scottish woman to see her poetry in print. The goal of our presentation today is, in short, to give a sacred voice back to Elizabeth Melville and her poetry, specifically her meditation on Psalm 42, which was intentionally set to the same psalm tune that all of Scotland would have known by heart as the tune of Psalm 42. When we examine her poetry outside of its sacred performance context, we're doing a disservice to Melville's theological creativity and entirely misinterpreting her work. In the time since the Reformation, her poetry has rarely been performed, and this poem specifically has never been performed publicly by a group, and certainly not with a fabulous lute player. And though the Psalms would have been set in 4 parts, this tune specifically has never been set to 4 parts in the way that it would have been sung during the Reformation. And it has never been set alongside the original Psalm tune. So, that is a lot of firsts. A lot of what we're doing here today is an attempt to attune our modern ears to the sure yet intimate sacredness of Melville's original poem, which would have been evident to a Scottish Reformation audience. When they heard Melville's poetry sung to the tune of Psalm 42, they would have immediately recognized the tune and placed her poem within that context. It's going to be much harder for our ears as modern listeners and modern singers to place ourselves back in that context, so we thought we'd do a few things to help ourselves along. First, we've set the presentation in Mark 1 Chapel. We've done this because we want to make you all feel like you're in a sacred space. It should be noted also that Scottish Reformation churches were often just repurposed cathedrals because they didn't have the money to tear down a cathedral and rebuild a Scottish church. So more often than not, all they did was turn the services to the side, with the altar being unused at one side of the church. Of course, this also means that the local lord or laird in Old Scots often took the seat near the altar for himself, his family, and other very rich and wealthy people. It's why we have asked our advisors to sit in this section today, Dr. Marcus Rothschild and Dr. Melanie Ross. So, the second thing that we have done is arranged for us to sing Psalm 42 as well as Melville's poem. We want to stress that her poem never would have been sung in a church service. The Psalms, along with a few sacred hymns, would have been sung in church, but Melville's poetry would not have been considered a hymn. However, because it was written to the same tune as the psalm itself and mimics the first line of the psalm, her audience would have immediately placed it within a sacred context. We just can't do this in the same way that a Scottish Reformation audience did, so we've cheated a little bit to regain a little bit of that sacredness. We've asked you to sit in a sacred place and sing Psalm 42 right before her poem in an attempt to, however artificially, recreate the way that a Scottish audience would have received her poetry, with immediate and familiar sacred recognition. But before we get to the fun part, where we guys ask you to sightsee and also to stumble through some old Scots, it's important that we set the historical stage for you. So, you'll find in your booklets a very brief history of the Scottish Reformation, told mostly through a political lens. You're welcome to get lost in that. But if you just want a crash course in Scottish Reformation history, the important things you need to know is that the Scottish Reformation is pretty late to the world of the Reformation in general. While Luther nails his 95 Theses in 1517, and Calvin published his Institutes in 1536, Scotland is still largely Catholic until the 1550s. And Scottish Protestants only gained political power in 1557 with the slow decline and eventual death of the Catholic regent Marie de Guise. The Protestant leaders James Stewart, the Earl of Moray, John Knox, and the other lords of the congregation briefly gained power after Marie de Guise's death, and then eventually again after the ousting of her daughter, Mary Queen of Scots, in 1568. Scottish Protestantism itself is best described as an offshoot of Calvinism, due primarily to the fact that its most prominent reformer studied under John Calvin in Geneva, John Knox.
So one of the Protestant reformers' goals was to change the way the Scottish people worshipped. Part of this was to change the way that the Scottish worship sounded. James Stewart requested first that the composer, David Peebles, write 4-part psalms, and then that Thomas Woad collect all of these psalms as well as other psalm liturgy into a common psalter. Peebles' harmonizations took full hold in Scotland and became commonplace staples of the Scottish church services. Psalm singing was an extremely important part of the service, especially when no minister could be in attendance. This was common at the beginning of the Reformation, where there were fewer Reformation ministers to go around. When there was no minister to give out the Eucharist, often psalm singing would take its place. The musical culture of Scotland grew through psalm singing, specifically until children and adults alike could recite the psalms in their specific tunes. Now, some of you may not have heard of Like as the Hert despreeth and bray, but I bet that a number of you have heard of Like as the Heart desireth the Waterbrooks. And perhaps even more of you have heard of Sicut Cervus, famously set to music by Palestrina. This is the text of Psalm 42. One of the purposes of this presentation is to put the recording of this performance on YouTube so that Elizabeth Melville's poetry is both elevated in importance and accessible to the public, should they wish to learn more about her writings or Old Scots in general. We will now begin with Trevor Scott's performance of the first verse of Psalm 42 with the harmonization by Scottish Reformation composer David Peebles. Thank you so much, Trevor. That was so beautiful. Yay! Now, can everyone please take a look at the part on the third line in Psalm 42, labeled tenor/kirk? So this is what Trevor just sang. We will sing the same thing on the neutral syllable do. Don't worry about the Old Scots yet. All right. So looking at Psalm 42. Do, that's your first note, and 3, 4. Do. Beautiful, everybody. Now let's split into 4-part harmony. Yay! Still on the syllable do. Can you raise your hand if you're a soprano? Those are higher treble voices. Okay. Can you raise your hand if you're an alto? Okay. Can you raise your hand if you're a tenor? Can you raise your hand if you're a bass? Can you raise your hand if you did not raise your hand? Okay. If you don't know what part you are, just pick one. Totally fine. All right. Let's sing the whole piece now. Do, do, do. Just on the neutral syllable do. And 3, 4. That's so lovely, everybody. Wow, it's so cool to hear this come
crazy.
to life.
Okay, anyways.
All right, now we'll coach the old Scots. Please grab a pencil if you have one. Can you raise your hand if you don't have a pencil? It's fine, I just have a bunch of them. Pencil, pencil, hands, pencil, pencil. Who needs a pencil? Pencil, get your pencil. Pencils, pencil. Yeah. Oh, that would be phenomenal. Thank you. Anybody else need a pencil? Keep your hands high up.
Sarah, in front of you.
So this is really important for us. If you could just write in phonetically what you hear. Does not need to be perfect, but just so we can get this as accurate as we possibly can. Pencils? Thank you so much. Okay. All right. So repeat after me. Like as the hert. Yeah, with an R roll. Hert. Des breath on bray. So that's a pure ed. Des breath on bray. The wall springs till obtain. Say des my Saul. That's Saul. Desired away. With thee, Lord. Te remain. My soul des threst. I'll do that again. My soul des threst. On wald draw near. The living God o mischt. That's a pure in. Mischt. Och. Juan Saul I. So not an and ah. Juan Saul I. Come on appear. In presence. O his sicht. Great. Awesome. Now let's try it all in 4-part harmony. You got this. All right, these are your pitches. Do, do, do. On text. That was great. Wonderful job, everyone. We will return to that later.
Okay, that was really cool. Okay, anyways, so Elizabeth Melville is born in Scotland in 1578, when Scotland is already firmly rooted in its Reformation identity. Though little is known about her personal biography, it's clear that by 1599, so at the ripe age of 21 years old, she's already gained a reputation as a talented young poet when Alexander Hume, the Scottish minister, praised her in the dedication to his poetry collection as the best female poet of her time. Melville is best known for her Calvinist dream poem, And Godly Dream, which is published in 1603, making her the first Scottish woman to see her poetry in print. It is a dialogue between a suffering narrator and Christ, rendered in 60 stanzas. And Godly Dream was so popular that 1606, just 3 years later, saw the third edition published with even more poetry attached. In the times since the Reformation, the large majority of Melville's works have been lost and forgotten. Her poems that did survive were mostly misattributed to her male contemporaries, including Alexander Montgomery, who was a court poet and favorite of King James I. Only within the last 15 to 20 years has her poetry found a new life and academic support. Melville's meditation on Psalm 42, which we're about to perform, was rediscovered by Dr. Jamie Reed Baxter in 2002 and published in his book of her poems in 2010. Dr. Reed Baxter has been in contact with us throughout this project, so it's been very helpful to us in our research. But aside from this book, the only place the poem in its entirety can be found is in the actual manuscript itself in the National Library of Scotland. This poem is included in a volume of sermons by Robert Bruce, the Scottish Presbyterian minister. The inclusion of Melville's poem in Bruce's manuscript places Melville's lyrical voice alongside one of the most prolific and well-known Scottish ministers of the time. The poem is a stunning 42 stanzas, 285 lines, focused on the first verse of Psalm 42. This poem would have been sung in communal groups around dinner tables or hearths as entertainment as much as theological practice. Today, we have chosen just 2 of those 42 stanzas to sing. The first one, which mimics the opening lines to Psalm 42, and the 7th one, which refers to Melville's hope for a loving, intimate union with Christ after a long life of grief and suffering.
So, the good news is that you have already learned all the music. Yay! And the even better news is that you get to learn a whole 2 verses more of Old Scots. Yay! We have contextualized Elizabeth Melville's poem as Herz fu faint by setting it to David Peoples' harmonization used for Psalm 42. We have also asked Professor Herod to play along with us on lute, because though instruments were never used in the Calvinist church, they would have been used in the intimate and communal settings of her poetry. We will begin with Trevor's and Professor Herod's performance of As Herz fu faint. Thank you so much. That was so beautiful. Thank you. All right, so now we get to skip the music part and jump straight to the Old Scots. This is verse 1. Repeat after me. As Herz fu faint.
As Herz fu faint.
You're really good at this. Wow. Des breath on pent.
Des breath on pent.
And that's not a Z, it's a S on des. So des breath on pent.
Des breath on pent.
For rennen rivers clear.
For rennen rivers clear.
Oppressed we way.
Oppressed we way.
I say, all say.
I say, all say.
For thee, my God.
For thee, my God.
Most dear.
Most dear.
Most dear. Good. My hert des breast. I'll do that one again. My hert des breast. My soul des threst. For thee the wall o' life. Yeah, wall, not well. Say so wall. Yeah, and then Juan sol I see. That's a pure on. Juan sol I see. Thy majesty. On lee this veil o' strife. All right, now let's just sing verse 1 on text in 4-part harmony, ending at measure 19 where we just stopped. This is the beginning on text. Do, 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 and 3, 4. That was beautiful. Just as a note, measure 13, it's wall, not well. I heard some wells. All right, now let's do the second verse, starting at measure 21. Repeat after me, please. For want I pine. For Christ I tine. Until this wilderness. My groan and grief. A thut relief. Des mer on mer increase. O live on well. Come on expel. My evir birnen drut. I'll do that again. My evir birnen drut. My spoofs mayst swait. Receive my sprite. With kisses. O thy moot. With kisses, O thy moot. I'm sure you can guess what that is. All right. Wonderful. Now let's sing just verse 2 on text, starting at measure 21. This is page 2. Do, 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 on text. And 3. Beautiful job. Now, let's sing the whole thing on text. Yay! Going back to the beginning. Do, 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 and 3. Beautiful job, everybody.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so first we want to acknowledge what it is that we've just done. So that is the first time since the Reformation that Melville's poetry has been performed and received by an audience of people who fully understands its sacred context. You are now essentially a Scottish Reformation audience. Congratulations. Now I want to dive a little bit deeper into Melville's poem, both the verses that we sang and a little of the rest of it. So let's begin with the opening verse. With these words, she means to call our attention and our minds to Psalm 42. Now, I'm going to read some of the text, but a little bit more anglicized. I think we've heard enough Old Scots for today. So, as heart's full fent does breathe and pant for running rivers clear, oppressed with woe, I sigh also for thee, my God, most dear. My heart does burst, my soul does thirst for thee, the well of life. When shall I see thy majesty and leave this vale of strife? If Psalm 42 claims that the author's soul panteth for God, then Melville's poetry is an expansion and embodiment of that panting. It is her own personal narrative of longing for a reunion with Christ. She claims her soul thirsts for God, the well of life, but goes on in the rest of the poem to describe her longing for Christ as the longing of a bride for her bridegroom. In the next verse that we sang, she claims that Christ is her spouse most sweet, who will receive her spirit with a kiss. It is a divine intimacy that she describes where Psalm 42 leaves off. She goes on to call Christ her love and life and begs him to come and end her strife. Later, she describes her ascendance into heaven, imagining what bliss it would be if her spirit, her spouse, could meet into the clouds above and see his face and him embrace. That is her only love. Though her poem contains some distinctly Calvinist themes, like thou choosedst me and I not thee before the world began, thy thoughts are sure and shall endure, thou changes not as man, which references the doctrine of predestination, her poetry is much more reminiscent of medieval mysticism, and perhaps even her Catholic contemporaries, like John of the Cross and his poem The Dark Night of the Soul, which also describes the ecstatic union between a woman and her bridegroom in lyrical form. Her poetry is rich with a deep intimacy that builds on scriptural foundation, but seems to transcend the text itself. So, all of this leads us back to our original question and the focus of this project. Why did Melville set her intimate, at times mystical poem to the recognizable tune of Psalm 42? Psalm singing was an integral part of the Protestant identity in Scotland, so why does Melville place her poem within that context? We believe that her choice reflects the emphasis of an intimate connection to Christ that relies on placing the individual's connection to God on the same plane as liturgy and scripture. Her voice reflects the larger purpose of the Reformation, to cut from the Christian life any kind of mediation between the individual and God. By placing her lyrical, creative, and intimate voice in the same language and tune as Scripture, she's asking us all to place our own personal relationship with Christ at the forefront of our minds. In many ways, the Scottish Reformation has gained a reputation as a religious movement steeped heavily in the desire for political control. Knox has more recently been compared to reformers like Munster, who saw political control as the means to achieve success for the Reformation. His political and deeply misogynistic writings, the dramatic ousting of Mary Queen of Scots, and even King James's eccentricity and obsession with witches and demons have taken center stage in conversations about the Scottish Reformation. In reality, the real work of the Scottish Reformation was performed by people like Elizabeth Melville. When we picture the Scottish Reformation, we should try to focus on the culture of intimate and communal sacredness. Melville's poem teaches us that the culture of the Scottish Reformation was as much focused on the individual hearts of the people as it was on the larger political or even liturgical movements. Melville's poetry is evidence that Scripture was not just a tool, but a text meant to evoke meditation, creation, and an intensely profound connection with God.
We're going to sing As Herz fu faint, just the second verse, one more time, just to save time. So if you wouldn't mind standing, please. And if you could actually just, if you're right by the camera, if you could just scoot a little bit to the side. This is page 2, measure 21. Page 2, measure 21. Do, do, do. On 4 want. And 3, 4. Thank you all so much.